Say, boy. Oh, come here. Oh. Mochi, you're a big, strong cat. You know that? You know you're a big, strong cat? How come you're so sweet? How come you're so sweet? All right, folks. Well, let's not waste any time and let's get started with what we need to talk about for today, which of course is going to be Napoleon. Now, to start class off today, I just wanted to make mention to you that as a warning, okay, we are coming up close to the end of this unit here. So, looking at probably next week, Monday, for the test. All right, I suspect that I'll be able to get most of the way through Napoleon by the end of the week. All right, plan for Monday. Excuse me, plan for Monday because I would like to test on Monday so that we can move forward and start talking about the next unit, which is the Industrial Revolution. But so. Today, let me move this over here so I can see what's going on. One second. Okay. So, now, so as I mentioned, be prepared because the test will most likely be Monday. And I have just the last little tail end of the PowerPoint that we've been working on here to talk to you about. And we finished off talking about, let me put this up on the screen so you guys can see it. We finished on talking about Napoleon's defense of the Directory. Early in his career, the first time that he is able to distinguish himself is when he leads this successful defense of the Directory against this royalist uprising that had taken place to try to overthrow the government. And so this is, he subdues them, and then shortly thereafter, of course, he is sent off to lead the French troops in a series of conquests across the Alps, which is the mountain range that lies in kind of southern France, across Switzerland, over into Austria, and so on. So he wins a series of victories. He ends up making it all the way down to Egypt, and the guy is a military genius. You know, he's really, really successful in his crusade across the countryside, defeating all sorts of different groups in various battles. The only time that he is faced with anything resembling a defeat is down in Egypt in 1798. There's a battle called the Battle of the Nile, and it was a battle where the British Royal Navy successfully managed to pin down the French Navy. But remember that Napoleon's not a naval commander, he's a land commander. And since he commands land troops, he's basically unbeatable on land. But he has other people who are running the Navy, the French Navy, and they struggle against the British Royal Navy because the British Navy was quite a thing. It was quite a sight. So, the conspiracy of equals was led by this guy who got nicknamed Gracchus Babeuf. This conspiracy of equals was formed to overthrow the Directory and replace it with a dictatorial, quote-unquote, democratic government, which would abolish private property and enforce equality. And of course, this is like kind of a predecessor to modern-day communism. Okay, it's a precursor to modern-day communism because this would be where the state just kind of takes over everything and forces everybody to be equal while also stripping away all of their liberty. And so this is not going to settle well with the Directory, who immediately goes about repressing the conspiracy of equals without any difficulty and guillotining Babeuf, the leader of this movement. Now, during the Directory years, there was a lot of growing dissatisfaction due to inflation and the fact that many people felt like the government wasn't really vested in the interests of the people. So they held elections, for example, in 1797 that resulted in a victory for royalists, people who were in favor of, people who were in favor of the king returning to power, royalists, old school conservatives, okay? And they basically, the Directory says, well, we can't have that happen. We can't let old school conservatives come back in, even if they did win the election fairly. And so the government, even though they lost, basically nullifies the results, and they don't allow the properly elected officials to come in and serve. And so the Directory is demonstrating itself to be pretty corrupt, okay? The members of the Directory more or less felt that a dictatorship favorable to the revolution was better than having conservatives come into power who could have potentially turned France back into a constitutional monarchy or an absolute monarchy. So, military successes during the Directory were really what enabled them to remain in power, and that's exactly thanks to Napoleon. Okay, the War of the First Coalition comes to an end by 1797, 1798. Okay, England gets completely isolated and removed its army from the continent of Europe. So Britain no longer has a standing army on the European continent. And Napoleon, as I mentioned, was defeated by the British Royal Navy in Egypt. But Napoleon's armies were the ones that were overall successful. Okay, so it just depends on if we're talking about the French Navy or the French Army. If it's the French Army, Napoleon's in charge, they're in good shape. If it's the French Navy, the British Royal Navy is going to have the upper hand against them. Okay, the end of the Directory. There was a conspiracy that began to emerge to save the revolution and prevent a royalist return to power. The Directory had demonstrated itself to be unable to attend to the needs of the people without being very corrupt and conflicting and so on. And so that same guy who I told you about way back in the beginning of the French Revolution, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes, remember that his title, Abbé, is just it means priest, basically, okay? Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes was the one who had given that famous speech called "What is the Third Estate?" And the answer in his speech was, "The third estate is everything." And that was the thing in the tennis that really inspired the tennis court oaths and the storming of the Bastille in the very beginning. Well, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes is at it again, looking out for the people of France and promoting the interest of the revolution. And so he is the leader of this conspiracy that's aiming to basically run a coup, C-O-U-P, against the government, overthrow the government, okay, coup d'etat. So Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes knows Napoleon. He is aware of Napoleon's military victories. And upon Napoleon's return to France in the beginning of 1799, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes approaches Napoleon to join the conspirators. They encourage Napoleon to be the guy who really becomes the face of this coup, using his military, who he had just, Napoleon's military was loyal to him, okay? He was an inspirational figure. He had led them to many, many, many victories. He comes back with his military, and he is viewed as an absolute hero of the state for all of his conquests. And Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes basically says, "You're the man, you're the guy, you're the person we need to be in charge of France. And by the way, in order to overthrow the Directory, we need your military too." And so this is where Napoleon, after being encouraged by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes to overthrow the Directory, runs what's known as the coup d'etat Brumaire. Okay, coup d'etat. And remember, that is pronounced coup d'etat, not coup d'etat. Okay? Mr. Knight, when did the coup d'etat take place? Okay, that's not how it's pronounced. Okay, coup d'etat Brumaire. Why Brumaire? Well, Brumaire was one of those, just like the Thermidorian reaction when I told you about that, the month of Thermidor correlated with July. The month of Brumaire correlated with November. And so the coup d'etat Brumaire is basically saying the November coup of 1799, where Napoleon overthrows the Directory and drove legislators away from the Directory, okay, which took place in the Legislative Assembly Hall. And a new constitution gets established, which began what was known as the consulate era, okay, of Napoleon's rule. And we are now entering into that final phase of the French Revolution that we're nicknaming for our class the Age of Voltaire. Why? Because remember that Voltaire, even though Voltaire was himself one of the most prominent contributors to the Enlightenment, Voltaire was really rather kind of conservative in his vision of how he saw the Enlightenment taking root in France. Voltaire believed in the idea of enlightened despotism, and you might recall towards the end of last semester learning about some of those enlightened despots, such as Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, with whom, by the way, Voltaire corresponded, and he even lived in the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia for a time. But it was Voltaire's opinion that the best way to get the Enlightenment principles to manifest was through essentially an enlightened despot, somebody who was an absolute monarch, or at least a monarchical type figure, who was themselves in favor of and a student of the Enlightenment. And Napoleon very much was this kind of figure. Napoleon comes to power in France after having been a student of the Enlightenment, after having grown up in the golden age of the Enlightenment, after having fought to support the French Revolution, going all the way back to 1789, okay? And remember that even though Napoleon was himself from the island of Corsica, which was just this small little island in the Mediterranean, and he was actually of Italian descent to a degree. He wasn't full-blooded French. that meant that he was kind of even though he was a noble, he was an outsider noble. He wasn't a noble that had been involved in all of the parties and dalliances of the court life of the Palace of Versailles. And so Napoleon isn't somebody who has a target on his back the way that some other nobles would have, who were more closely associated with Louis XVI and the upper echelons of Second Estate politics at that time. Napoleon is able to continue to be a champion of the revolution. And when he overthrows the Directory and takes on the title of First Consul of France, consul being C-O-N-S-U-L, okay, First Consul, it's those years of Napoleon's rule that in many ways are some of his most successful. He's ruling France very much as a king, okay, but and as a result of that, we have to understand that Napoleon does end up curtailing certain freedoms. As we look at this last slide here of this of this PowerPoint, okay, you can see that the anatomy of the English Revolution, the English Civil War, took on a very similar anatomy to the French Revolution. And this, I'll connect it back to Napoleon in just a second here, but follow my line of thinking. When we first start the revolution, of course, the old regime is in power, the conservatives, the royalists, the king. Okay, Louis XVI is in power. The same way as in England. During the English Civil War, the king, Charles I, was in power. You remember him. He was the first king to be beheaded by his own people in European history. And so Charles I is removed from power. He is executed in 1649. And then the revolution, at first, when the English Civil War is happening, the revolution is being run by moderates in Parliament, okay, Puritans and Presbyterians. But eventually, we remember that the English Civil War went into that really radical phase where you had the Commonwealth of England, which was supposed to be a republic, but it was really just a military dictatorship under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Very, very, very similar to the French Revolution, and how, during the radical phase of the French Revolution, you had the Reign of Terror, okay, under the Committee of Public Safety, where the Jacobins took control, okay. In the English Civil War, it was the Independents and the New Model Army, okay, who were loyal to Oliver Cromwell, and he had his own reign of terror, and that he basically established a military dictatorship, swinging, the political shift in the opposite direction. Was when Oliver Cromwell, towards the end of his life, he dies. People are sick of the reign of terror of Oliver Cromwell. And how does the English government respond? They go right back to kind of that same Thermidorian type of reaction that we saw in the French Revolution, where we see the return of conservatives to power under Charles I's son, Charles II. And so what does Parliament do after the radical phase is done? They put a monarch back onto the throne. Now, it's not an absolute monarch, okay, because remember, Charles II is forced to sign various things that limit his authority, but nonetheless, they put the king back on the throne. And that's very similar to what happens in France, because when the French Revolution swings back to a more conservative, and here's your line of radical versus conservative right here in the middle here. When the French Revolution swings back conservative, they essentially put Napoleon as a monarchical type figure on the throne of France. Okay? So, now there is one thing that I have to mention that I didn't talk yet about with the coup d'etat. The coup d'etat kind of happened seemingly in a little bit of backwards order. Maybe that's the only way it could have happened, but nonetheless, hear me out, okay? I want you to just consider this for a second. All right, let's say, for example, we were meeting in the classroom. Okay, let's say we're meeting in the classroom, and everybody in the class is, you know, we're all hanging out, and I say, hey, you know what? You know, let's order pizza. Okay, and I get pizza for everyone. Okay, and everybody eats their pizza. We get done with eating pizza in class, and then I say to you, hey, who wants pizza for lunch? And everybody's looking around the class like, has Mr. Knight just lost his mind? Okay, and you're like, well, yes, I guess, since we just finished eating pizza for lunch, yes, right? Like, this is kind of what Napoleon does. He overthrows the government, okay? He overthrows the directory. He writes a new constitution, and then he holds a plebiscite, which is a general referendum. It's when people are allowed to vote on an issue, okay? And it's overwhelmingly approved, but here's the thing. In the plebiscite, basically, he's asking people, after he's already overthrown the government, hey, who wants me to overthrow the government and write a new constitution and take France in a new direction? And the people of France, because he's already done this, are like, well, you just did that. You just overthrew the government and wrote a new constitution. So yes, I guess we're in favor of it. You know, the people were actually in support of Napoleon. I am kind of halfway making a joke here, but the reality is that you wonder what would have happened if people overwhelmingly said no. You know, then what? But they didn't. They loved Napoleon. Napoleon, it was a pretty safe bet because they hated, people by this point were so sick of the directory that they probably would have liked to see any type of change that got rid of the directory, which had demonstrated itself to be very corrupt. And so, you know, people overwhelmingly approved Napoleon's coup and his new constitution, and ultimately he becomes the new leader of France, the first consul of France. Okay, so I'm going to close this one now. We'll save the changes, whatever I made to it. That's fine. Okay, and now we will move on to this new PowerPoint. Now, in case I didn't mention this, this is already made available to you on Canvas. Okay, it's in the lecture PowerPoints folder on Canvas. Just double check, make sure it's displaying right. Yep, okay, good. And so you can access this and follow along if you like, or just watch the video, whichever you want. So Napoleon began his reign as an enlightened despot who instituted numerous significant reforms in France that some of them lasted for a long time. Eventually, though, Napoleon's lust for power and conquest led him to grossly overextend his empire beyond his ability to control it. And this is what ultimately resulted in his defeat. You know, there's an old school colloquialism that's something to the effect of power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Perhaps you've ever heard this phrase before. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we've seen many men, and I do deliberately point out men because it's happened far more with men than women in history, but whenever you see somebody who becomes a powerful ruler, they, not unlike the Lord of the Rings, for those of you that have ever seen Lord of the Rings before, why do they give the ring to Frodo? It's because he's a hobbit, he is modest, and he has the best temperament not to be corrupted by the ring. But even Frodo finds himself in a position where the ring's power is it's difficult to not abuse it and become kind of drunk on the power that the ring possesses or offers. Okay, Napoleon, very similarly to the incorruptible Maximilian Robespierre, once he finds himself in this position, he wants more. Okay, he has an insatiable thirst for power and control. Now, let's just take a few minutes to dispel a few rumors, stories that perhaps you've heard about Napoleon. One of them being that Napoleon was just this short man who was this, like, had short, angry man complex or whatever. That's not really probably a very accurate portrayal of Napoleon. There's no question that Napoleon is viewed by many other Europeans in history as essentially a dictator who tried to take over the entire planet. Well, really mostly just Europe, but the entire continent of Europe minimally. And so because Napoleon ultimately is defeated, you know, they say that, I hate this phrase, but they say it all the time, history is written by the victors. There was a whole lot of effort made by the British to kind of run Napoleon's or rake Napoleon's name across the coals after he died, or after he is defeated. And so, you know, Napoleon kind of becomes the butt of various British jokes and stuff like that. For his time, Napoleon was really an average size. Yes, they are, Jessica. They're in the lecture PowerPoints folder on Canvas. Okay, it's a new PowerPoint on there. All right, but anyhow, Napoleon was an average-sized man for his day. Okay, Napoleon was about 5'6", 5'7", which was not particularly short, but not particularly tall for his time. Remember that people's diets during this era, although they're improving thanks to the agricultural revolution and stuff, it was pretty commonplace for people to have stunted growth as a result of a lack of proper prenatal care, a lack of a proper understanding of medicine and nutrition and all of these other things. Certainly people in modern times grow to be much, much taller than they did in the early 1800s. So Napoleon's not that short comparative to his time. Also, when we think about Horatio Nelson was like 5'2". He was a tiny, tiny, tiny little man. And no one ever talks about Horatio Nelson's height. So why should it be an issue with Napoleon? After all, both of the men are cut from the same cloth in terms of their military background, their relatively high status, both of them being white European males, etc., etc. So anyhow, the height really shouldn't be a sticking factor for Napoleon, but nonetheless, that's what everybody likes to say about him. But Napoleon is at the end of the day just a man. You know, he is just as prone to influences of corruption, or at least not as much corruption, but maybe at least just a thirst for more power as anyone else is. And so we see towards the end of his reign, Napoleon's head gets a little bit big for his shoulders. Okay. So as I mentioned to you, we are now in the final phase of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic era, which we sometimes call the Age of Voltaire because it very closely resembles Enlightened Despotism, which is precisely what Napoleon offers to the state of France. You know, there is one other thing to mention about Napoleon that's probably you know, worth saying about him. And I brought this up last class too. Napoleon, I can't state enough about, for his time, he is an absolute military genius. He is extremely clever on the battlefield, and people have no ability to predict his next move. And so as a result of this, and as a result of his numerous successes on the battlefield, he was able to establish puppet governments in a lot of places in Europe. What is a puppet government? A puppet government, much like a puppet that you put on your hand, and I'm sorry to ruin the magic for you in case you still thought that puppets were the ones that were talking instead of the ventriloquists. that are throwing their voice to make it seem like the puppet is talking. But to be honest with you, the puppet's not talking, okay? The puppet doesn't have a voice. It's just a thing that does whatever the person who's controlling the puppet makes it do or say, okay? And so this is how a puppet government works as well. Napoleon installs in various places in Europe, basically his own family members. Even in France, or excuse me, in Spain, for example, Napoleon had a younger brother named Joseph Bonaparte, who was placed as the King of Spain. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing this up is because of something that we need to be aware of moving into the rest of the semester here, which is this idea of nationalism. And I'd really like you guys, as we move throughout the rest of the semester, to keep a very close pulse on this term nationalism. If you ever took the class called AP Human Geography last year, or if you end up taking it in the future, you may learn about certain forces known as, and we use them, they're borrowed from physics actually, but centripetal versus centrifugal forces, okay? Centripetal versus centrifugal forces. A centripetal force is a force that pushes people towards the center, towards unity, towards, towards collectiveness, okay? A centrifugal force, okay, centrifugal force, is one that is a force that pushes people out, away from the center, okay? And this is considered a disunifying force, or a fragmenting force. And the thing that's really interesting about nationalism is that nationalism can actually function both directions. Okay, nationalism can function both directions. In the case of Napoleon, he found this to be very true in his time as the ruler of France. Because on one hand, Napoleon uses nationalism as a weapon to unify the people of France together. People believe that Napoleon is first and foremost a servant of the state. And so not only are they very loyal to Napoleon, but their loyalty to Napoleon transcends him as a figure into what he represents as the nation, or the people of France. Okay, he is seen as a hero of the state, as a hero of the nation, of the people of France. And so he wields nationalism as a unifying force for the French people. At the same time, though, nationalism is in some sense precisely what led to Napoleon's downfall. Because as Napoleon started to take over all of these other places in Europe, one thing that became very quickly apparent is that even if Napoleon's army 100 times out of 100 would defeat the Austrians in battles, he could not force Austrian people to feel French, to be loyal to the French state. Same with Spain, same with Britain, same with Russia. It became nationalism that actually ended up being, the very sentiment that brought Napoleon down, because people didn't want to be ruled by the French when they didn't speak French, they didn't live in France, they didn't have any affinity for the French Revolution, and so on. And so, and then also to give you another example of how nationalism, can be a dividing force, is that take for example Austria. You might remember me telling you that one of the things that set Austria apart from a number of the other absolute monarchies of that time was that Austria had a number of sizable ethnic minorities living within their territories. For example, the Magyars, the Hungarians, right? Also the Romanians, also the Bulgarians, also the Serbians, also the Bosnians, also the Slovenians, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of different nationalities that lived inside the boundaries of the Austrian state. And this, over time, in the age of nationalism, is going to reduce the effectiveness of Austrian rule, precisely because the people that they are ruling do not themselves even feel Austrian, or in many cases speak German as the Austrians do. And so we see nationalism in the era of the early 1900s start to operate as a fragmenting force that is going to actually cause Austria to begin to decline. On the other hand, in Germany, just to the north, as we get towards the later part of the semester, we'll talk about German unification. Germany is moving more towards centralized German national identity. And this is going to be a unifying factor for Germany that strengthens Germany and the effectiveness of their military and of their state bureaucracy. So I just want to make sure that I deliberately talked a little bit about nationalism, because it is a very interesting factor in history that we still live with today. Okay, we are seeing a resurgence, actually, and we have been for about the last 10 or so years, in global nationalism. Okay, we're seeing nationalistic movements in Britain with the whole Brexit thing. We're seeing nationalism movements in Denmark, in Sweden, in Germany, and so on and so forth. And also, by the way, not to move too far away from home, we're seeing it right here in the United States of America. We have a pretty profound nationalist movement happening right now, which, you know, as you guys know, at the start of the year, launched a riot at the Capitol. And this is done by hardcore nationalists, okay? But we have seen this happen before in history, where hardcore extremist nationalists take over the government, and it always results in one thing, and that's totalitarianism, and that's not good. So we need to keep democratic systems in place and allow the voice of the people to be heard. Okay. I'll get off my soapbox and continue talking about Napoleon now. All right. Born of Italian descent to a Corsican family on the French island of Corsica. Corsica is no longer controlled by France, but it was at this time. And he was an avid child of the Enlightenment, as I mentioned earlier, and the French Revolution. He was associated with the Jacobins, and he advanced rapidly in the army due to the fact that so many of those high-ranking military officers of the French military had left. Remember that there was that whole émigré movement where a bunch of officers had fled France and were residing in other areas. Okay? Eventually, of course, he inspired a divided nation in France during the Directory period into a united nation, precisely because he was utilizing nationalism. But this very much came at the price of individual liberty. One of the things about enlightened despots, and the reason that Voltaire advocated for enlightened despots to rule, is because Voltaire was of the opinion that if you had too radical of a government that gave too many freedoms out to people, that it would ultimately result in chaos, bloodshed, and war. And so Napoleon, recognizing that careful balance between freedom and law and order, does end up, if we're being honest, curtailing some of the freedoms that had been won or practiced, at least, by earlier revolutionaries in France during the Reign of Terror and earlier periods of the Revolution. And he's doing this precisely to maintain order and prevent chaos. Give me just 1 second. I have the hiccups. Could I have a swig of coffee here? Okay, so let's get into the consulate period, talking about Napoleon's early part of his reign. So this is the period that we sometimes refer to as the period of enlightened reform of Napoleon. Some of his best contributions to the history of France came in the first 5 years of his rule. Napoleon took power on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1799, with this constitution that he wrote basically giving him supreme power. And as first consul, he behaved very much the same way as an absolute ruler would, rather than a revolutionary statesman such as, let's say, Jacques Necker or some person like that. He demanded loyalty to the state. He rewarded ability. One of the things that we'll talk about in our lecture today is talking about the meritocratic system that Napoleon enacted. He really wanted to promote and place people into positions who demonstrated particular ability, talent, skill sets, and so on. And this was not always the case. Remember that previously, before the revolution, it was very, very commonplace for corruption to lead people to positions of power through what's called political cronyism. A crony is a buddy. Okay, so, and we've seen presidents do this here in the United States, by the way, most recently demonstrated by Trump, and he's not the first president that's done that. Sorry guys, I lost my connection for a second there. Anyhow, I was talking about how it can happen where when people rise to certain positions of power, they take and they put their friends into positions, or family members, or whatever else, even if they may not be the best person for the job. And of course, we saw this happen with the Trump administration recently. President Trump had put into power a number of his friends from the private sector who he was business partners with. He put family members into cabinet positions and other things. And so it's a pretty common thing to happen. And another president that did this was Andrew Jackson, and there will be other presidents in the future who will do the same thing. I'm most certain. But Napoleon really goes out of his, and Napoleon isn't even completely immune from it. After all, he did put his brother as king of Spain. However, when it comes to the general population and the military and who gets to be promoted to the highest ranks in the military and highest positions within the government or the bureaucratic state system, he really does go out of his way to try to create a more meritocratic system or meritocratic system where people are being promoted based on their ability level rather than just be put into positions based on the fact that they were born as some fancy pants noble or something like that. He does demand loyalty to the state, he rewards ability, and he creates an effective hierarchical bureaucracy, and he is really the last and most eminent of the enlightened despots of Europe. So we can very much categorize him in a similar category as people like Catherine the Great or Frederick the Great or Joseph II of Austria. He's a very similar type of ruler to those people. Of course, the major difference between him and those folks is that Napoleon is not of royal blood. He is not from the Bourbon dynasty. And as a result of that, a lot of the absolute monarchs across the rest of Europe are highly critical of Napoleon because they don't view him to be a legitimate monarch. They see him as a usurper of monarchical authority. They see him as a pretender, somebody who has come to power without having the legitimacy of a proper king. And Napoleon goes well out of his way to demonstrate that he is a legitimate monarch, and in fact has various paintings commissioned of himself that very much resemble even former paintings of Louis XVI, so as to make himself appear to be the legitimate ruler of France, even though he is not a legitimate king. Okay, moving forward, talking a little bit about some of the reforms that Napoleon put into practice. Probably one of the most important and long-lasting changes Napoleon made was the Napoleonic Code, which was the first clear and complete codification of French law. And the idea of it was to make the law the same for everyone. Okay, and this legacy of Napoleon really has continued. It's changed obviously over time, but in large part, the idea of codifying different types of laws, penal codes, commercial codes, criminal procedures, civil codes, things like that. We have all of the same things right here in our own nation. Okay, you know, if the neighbor kid comes by and uses a baseball bat to break your mailbox open or whatever, you would have to take them to small claims court because you're just simply trying to replace a mailbox. Okay, although actually for a mailbox, if defamation or rather desecration of mailboxes is actually a federal crime. That's actually probably not a very good example. But let's say, you know, whatever, your neighbor kid is playing baseball and they, you know, throw a ball or you know, hit a ball through your window and it breaks your window. Okay, you could take them to small claims court and have them, you know, be responsible to pay for the replacement of your window. Okay. If somebody was to, you know, I'm just taking a really dramatic example now, murder on the other hand, okay, or theft or something like that, these are criminal codes, okay, where you would, you know, they would be arrested and they'd go through a criminal trial and stuff like that, okay. But it's an entirely different set of laws for criminal procedures versus, you know, civil procedures, civil court, small claims court, things like that. All right, and the idea, of course, being that the law works the same for everybody. That's called due process of law. So one of the things that he does emphasize is protection of private property, including even the private property of peasants who had only recently been able to purchase those lands from the state that the state had taken away from the church. We'll talk more about that in just a second here. Overall, these codes, the Napoleonic Code, resulted in a very strong central government and administrative unity. So the laws were being administered the same way in all departments of France, no matter where they were. There were some regions of France that were initially resistant to Napoleon's rule. In Western France, in the region of the Vendée, where the revolution had faced resistance before. But many achievements of the revolution were made permanent. Equality before the law, freedom of religion was valued, the state was to be completely secular, there was not going to be an established religion the way that there was under the age of absolutism, guaranteeing property rights, the total and complete abolition of serfdom. And women do gain some inheritance rights, but we have to be honest that Napoleon really wasn't that equitable to women. Women under Napoleon very much remained second-class citizens, subdued to male authority in and outside of the house. So, for example, women were denied equal status with men. Women and children were legally dependent on their husband or father. Divorce was actually harder to obtain for women during the Napoleonic era than it had been earlier in the Revolution. Women also were not allowed to buy or sell property or start businesses without their husband's consent. So we can see a number of different ways here on this slide where women's rights were definitely curtailed in favor of men's legal rights and privileges. So that is one of the downsides of Napoleon's rule. He had careers that were open to talent, and this included careers in the military as well as careers in the government. And citizens, theoretically at least, were able to rise in government service purely according to their abilities, thanks to these meritocratic practices, awarding people based on merit, or ability rather, to to higher levels in the government and in the military. So a new imperial nobility does get created to reward the most talented generals and officials. So we do see this quasi aristocratic class of people who Napoleon viewed to be the most talented and had the best of the opportunities. Although theoretically anyone could rise up if they distinguish themselves, there does tend to be a little bit of this new imperial, meaning related to the French Empire or Napoleon running it, imperial aristocratic noble class that gets created. Wealth at this time does very much determine your status. However, I will add to that Napoleon does pave the way for a growing middle class to emerge in France during this time. Neither military commissions nor civil offices under Napoleon could be bought or sold. And this was a way of Napoleon trying to crack down on corruption within the government, where people would be able to negotiate deals, private deals that would give them positions of power, and he cuts down on that. He also invites all of the nobles that had previously been living in exile back to France. And the way that he goes about doing this, remember that these nobles, the reason they fled was precisely because they were so fearful of the revolution. Now that Napoleon is in charge, though, he wants all French people living back in France. And so he granted amnesty, in other words, peaceful settlement, to about 100,000 émigrés, nobles who had left France, in return for a loyalty oath. And so they were, if they were willing to take an oath of loyalty to Napoleon, they were allowed to return back to France. And indeed, many of them do. And many of them actually end up even occupying some of those new imperial noble positions that I was referring to on the last slide. So previously expelled members of the noble class, the Second Estate of France, are welcomed back under Napoleon in return for their oath of loyalty to him. Some nobles from foreign countries even served Napoleon with distinction. And you also had, by this point, the sans-culotte had been completely discredited and subdued, and so we no longer have that real violent extremist group of people in and around Paris who were propagating violence and chaos to promote the revolution. They were no longer politically significant during this time. Also, Napoleon notably cracks down on the right of workers to form trade unions because he viewed trade unions as potentially wielding the ability to pose a real threat to the French economy. And he doesn't want workers going on strike, being able to collectively assemble and bargain for better working conditions, better pay, better living conditions, better quality of life, and so on. And he doesn't want that because he wants them to continue to work and be productive and not question that. Okay. Religious reforms. I remember a couple of days back, Evelyn, if I remember right, was the one who asked about what was the Concordat of 1801. Well, here it is. The Concordat of 1801 was with the Roman Catholic Church. And basically, Napoleon had a pulse on the public sentiment. He knew that particularly for peasants, their religion was very important to them. Now, Napoleon is himself not a super religious guy, if we're being completely honest. He probably was more interested in his power as a ruler than he was, in terms of his faith. Nonetheless, he does know that the people are of France, their religion is important to them. And so he basically invites the Pope back to France on certain conditions, okay? Why does Napoleon invite the Roman Catholic Church, invite the Pope back to France? Well, not only does he know that a lot of people are going to love this decision, they are going to, he knows that if he invites the Catholic Church back to France, that the people of France will love him for it. Very Machiavellian move, by the way, okay? he is not doing this because he cares that much about the Roman Catholic Church. He's doing this because Napoleon is not a stupid man. Napoleon is a smart man, and he knows that in order to be an effective ruler, you need to have the good graces of your people. And so he wins over the affection of the people of France by granting religious toleration and inviting back the Pope to France. Also, the other side of this is the foreign element. So when we think about external threats to Napoleon's rule, he knows that the Pope is very closely associated with the absolute monarchs of the Habsburg dynasty, of the Hohenzollern dynasty, and of the Hanover dynasty or Hanoverian dynasty up in Britain. And so, not as much Britain, to be honest with you, but the point, because Britain was Protestant, my mistake. But the point being that certainly the Tsar of Russia, the Romanov dynasty, the Habsburgs and so on, they were all very closely tied with the Pope. And by inviting the Pope back to visit France and inviting the Roman Catholic Church to be Roman Catholicism to be practiced in France again, he knows that this will weaken the Church's link to external threats to France in the form of absolute monarchs from other places who were trying to get the Bourbon dynasty back in power and take Napoleon out. So he wants to weaken the Church's ties to those places, and that was another reason that he invited the Church back to France. There were some conditions. He's not doing this to make Roman Catholicism have undue influence over the state of France. Remember that when he invites the Pope back, when he invites the Roman Catholic Church back to France to be publicly worshipped, he is not doing it because he wants to make Roman Catholicism the established church. So the Pope had to agree to certain principles, certain provisions, in order to be welcomed back. One of them was that the papacy, the Pope, had to renounce any claims that they had over church property that had been seized during the Revolution. The early years of the Revolution, you might remember I talked to you about the civil constitution of the clergy, which had rapidly gobbled up church lands by the state, and that the state then turned around and started selling those lands to peasants. And so now there were a lot of peasants living on lands that were previously owned by the church. And the church, of course, rejected that and always maintained that they had the proper authority to reclaim those lands. And Napoleon basically says, look, if you want the Catholic Church back in France, okay, you got to give up those claims to those lands because you're not getting them back. Also, our government is going to retain the power to nominate or depose bishops of France, okay? And in return for this, he said, I will allow the refractory clergy, those who had resisted the civil constitution of the clergy, to replace those bishops that had sworn an oath of loyalty to the state. So basically he's saying, I will put priests back into their positions as priests who have been known in earlier years to be against the revolution. Okay, so he basically says, I'm going to allow all priests, whether or not they were or were not in favor of the civil constitution of the clergy, to come back into their positions as priests. However, the church is not getting their lands back, and the French state will retain the ability to hire and fire bishops as it seems necessary. Okay, the Pope also had to give up I already said that claims to church. Okay, so the Catholic worship started to be allowed in public again. Remember that during the Reign of Terror, Maximilian Robespierre had made it illegal to publicly worship the Christian gods. He wanted everybody to be worshiping the goddess of reason. Church seminaries start to get reopened. They started extending legal toleration to all people, Catholics, Protestants of all sorts, Jews, even atheists, all who received the same civil rights. In other words, your religion was to be completely tolerated, okay? There was going to be freedom of religion, and no one was going to be judged differently in a court of law based on what faith they practiced, okay? And again, this is this idea of secularism, trying to keep France a secular state that values the Enlightenment principles over dogma of religion. The Pope gave up his claims to church lands in France, in case you didn't hear that one already for the third time, and replaced the revolutionary calendar with the Christian calendar. So after the Concordat of 1801, France goes back to using the traditional Christian calendar of January, February, March, etc. To dispel the notion of an established church, Napoleon put Protestant ministers of all denominations, even old school Huguenots and other people like that, into the state payroll to demonstrate once again that your religion would not be a determining factor on whether or not you could hold state positions and other things like that. Okay, another thing that Napoleon did that was very, very important early on in his consulate era of his rule was he established the Bank of France. Now, if we're being historically honest here, this was probably 100 years after France should have first established a Bank of France, but Napoleon is the first one to get it successfully done. And if you'll recall, we talked about how England had already established the Bank of England back in 1699, which very much was the crucial factor that allowed England to emerge victorious during this 7 Years' War in the 1750s and early 1760s. But France at that point didn't have a national bank. What does a national bank do? It essentially allows you to take out debt against the nation, against future revenue collected through either bonds that people purchase or through just taxation dollars that provide revenue for the state to pay down the national debt. And so the Bank of France brought a lot of unity to France because it stabilized the national economy and it offered sound currency that wasn't going to be devalued very quickly the same way that the assignats were in the early part of the French Revolution, and establishing public credit, as I mentioned a minute ago. The economic reforms that Napoleon put into place thanks to the Bank of France helped to stimulate low food prices, low unemployment rate, which is good. You want your people of your country working. Unemployment is one of those hallmark signals that we use to measure the health of an economy. We want a low unemployment rate. He also lowered taxes on farmers, and the peasants that had purchased those church lands got to keep them. Okay, they got to retain those lands, which was good for them because that means that you have what's known as a bunch of yeomen, and I'm going to type this word in here, yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers, and you'll see it in just a second here because I'm on a little bit of a delay. Yeoman farmers are farmers that own the land that they live and work. And so this is good because it means that they are going to have a foot in the door to creating wealth, as opposed to if you're what's known as a tenant farmer. Just like in modern day times, if you're a tenant, that means you're living on land or in a house or a building, like an apartment or a condo or whatever, that is owned by somebody else. What we call, even to this day, a landlord. Okay, that's where those terms come from. So if you're a tenant in a place and you're living there, the money that you're paying is going to someone else. When you live in a house, the money that you're paying for your house is going to you because you own the house and you're simply paying down the loan that you took out for your own property. And so this helps you to grow wealth over time much more quickly than if you're paying every month every couple of weeks, whatever, to your landlord, and that money is gone and it goes in the hands of somebody else. Okay, he also, in his financial policies, created an independent peasantry that became the backbone of the French democracy, because the French peasants, increasingly now that they own land, start to be able to participate in the government, even not only by way of voting, but even in capacities as officials and servants of the government. Tax collection across the entire country of France became much more efficient under Napoleon's early rule. However, as I mentioned, workers were still not allowed to form guilds or trade unions. He does retain the rather conservative and strict policy of the Le Chapelier law that we talked about before of 1791 that made it very difficult for workers in urban France to unionize. It actually made it illegal for them to unionize. They were not allowed to, because unions can cause strikes. They can cause economic trouble, and he doesn't want to have that happen. Educational reforms were another aspect of Napoleon's early rule. Now, one of the things that you may not know about public education is that it really was not very widespread in this time. Unlike today, where it's legally mandated that children attend school up to a particular age, back in these days, they did not have massive public school systems and stuff anywhere in Europe. In fact, they aren't going to for quite some time yet. We don't really see the first widespread compulsory education system put into place in Europe until the Germans do it in about 1870 or so. Okay, but Napoleon does begin, at least begin the trend of opening the doors to public lycees, okay, is what they're called, lycees. Lycees were these public seminars that people were able to attend that offered higher education to those who demonstrated certain proclivities in state governance and other things like that. So you could attend these lycees, become educated in state service, and then you would take an examination, basically a state exam, and once you passed it, you would then be deemed as worthy of being able to hold positions in public office. And again, much of this is done with the idea of creating state officials who are resistant to corruption and things like that, and are working to help the state function more smoothly and equally for everyone. And so, this is really cool, because even today we still see remnants of this in the American system. Right? To become a teacher, for example, I had to take all sorts of different public or state exams to, pass my teaching credential and become licensed by the state to become a teacher and all of these kinds of things. And so, and for anything, you want to be a lawyer, you got to take the bar. You want to be a doctor, you have to take, a number of different medical license exams. And you want to become a diplomat, you have to take the foreign service exam. There's all sorts of different exams that we have to demonstrate that people are knowledgeable about what they're about to pursue a career in. And so you don't want to have a bunch of know-nothings coming in and serving in government and wrecking the place. You want to have people who are competent individuals serving in their capacity to the best of their ability. And this is the pathway of education that Napoleon comes up with to try to help ensure that goal. So education was very important for social standing and advancement in France, and Napoleon sought to increase the size of the middle class to get more people educated, because he knew that an education was one of the most viable pathways to improving the economy and having a more advanced state bureaucratic system and a more advanced economy. So, and people who make more money buy more stuff, and this would help, what they say, a rising tide lifts all ships. Okay, that's an old school phrase. Rising tide lifts all ships. The more money that your middle class has, the more people who have a pathway towards opportunity, the more growth of your economy that you're going to see. Creation of a police state. Not everything that Napoleon does is in the name of freedom, because remember that very much Napoleon's reign is characterized by, trying to maintain order. And one of the ways he goes about doing that is by creating a vast network of spies to keep tabs on thousands of citizens who were under constant surveillance to make sure that they weren't taking part in seditious activities. Sedition is when you're trying to undermine the government. And so he's trying to make sure that these folks are not going to pose a threat to his rule. After 1810, he gets even more authoritarian by now imprisoning anyone who were considered political suspects plotting against the state, in very much the same way that there were a lot of political prisoners during the Reign of Terror. The government under Napoleon had no qualms about ruthlessly putting down opposition. Particularly, there were a number of guerrilla warfare fighters. Guerrilla warfare is just a tactic to describe a kind of chaotic, disorganized approach to fighting in battles that was very non-traditional of the time. It's really hard to fight against guerrilla warfare tactics because they use, traps, shooting from hidden areas, urban, city fighting, things like that, which was not commonplace in this time. Wars, the way that wars were fought in this time is that, both nations would gather their forces and meet on a battlefield, and the battle would take place in a very orderly way. Okay, it was a formal event. War was very formal in many ways. Guerrilla warfare is extremely chaotic and disorganized, and it made it very difficult for Napoleon's troops, particularly in Spain, where he was fighting against Spanish guerrillas, to defeat them, because the guerrillas never stop fighting. They just go into hiding, and then whenever they have an opportunity to strike, they do. And so in Western France, anyone who was resistant to Napoleon would be ruthlessly put down. And the most notorious action was the execution of the Duke of Enghien. Drawbacks of Napoleon's reform is that there was severe inequality for women. Of course, workers were not allowed to form trade unions. Liberty and republicanism are repressed in the name of order and reduction of chaos. So it's not going to be as liberal and republican and free as it was during the earlier part of the revolution. However, it will offer a lot more stability. And he does still secure some liberties, such as freedom of religion, for example. And he does himself practice nepotism, which is placing family members on the thrones or in positions. And he does this of the nations that he conquered and turned into puppet governments. So Napoleon fought a number of wars, of course, because not everybody supports Napoleon's rule during the consulate era, and the wars were typically short in the early years of his reign. The only nation that pretty much remained continually at war with France was Britain, who even through this short period of time known as the Peace of Amiens, the British still remained quite mobilized against Napoleon and ready for war at any time. So there were four great powers: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, but they don't all come back to simultaneously fight against France the way that they had been during the war of the First Coalition back during the Reign of Terror days. They don't all come back to fight against Napoleon until 1813. For much of that period of time between 1799 and 1813, all of these other nations, with the exception of Britain, are so afraid that Napoleon will use his military to completely decimate them that they basically just go along with whatever Napoleon says out of fear of retaliation. There is a war of the Second Coalition in 1798 and 1801. That was the one where, that was even before Napoleon took power in 1798 at the Battle of the Nile, but it continues against Britain in his first 2-3 years of after his coup. And Napoleon is victorious in the War of the Second Coalition, and the war with Britain ends temporarily with the Treaty of Luneville and the Peace of Amiens. Austria had lost some of their possessions, and this interim peace here, this short-lived peace from about 1802 to 1804, where the British and the French formally stopped fighting with one another, and during this time, Napoleon turns Switzerland back into, or turns Switzerland rather, into a puppet government as well. Kids, I have exhausted my time. I've gone all the way up to 10:26. I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in this morning. I hope all of you are having a wonderful day, and we'll tune back in on Friday to finish out this unit, finish talking about Napoleon, and we'll see you then. Take care.